There's a version of Canada that doesn't appear on travel blogs. No curated itineraries. No Instagram hashtags with 100,000 posts. Just coordinates, a runway that might not be paved, and the particular silence that comes from being somewhere most people will never go. Canada is the second largest country on Earth, and a staggering portion of it, northern reaches, subarctic coastlines, islands that don't show up on casual maps, is accessible only by small aircraft. Charter flights, bush planes with floats, supply runs that double as passenger service twice a week, if the weather holds. These aren't places that got left behind. Some were never really part of the connected world to begin with. Others once had roads, had people, had futures that never arrived. What they share is something harder to name, a quality of existing slightly outside the version of Canada most Canadians know. Remote in a way that isn't romantic so much as it is simply true. 11 places, all fly-in only, all carrying something worth understanding. About geography, about policy, about what happens to communities when the infrastructure never comes, or came and left. Fly northwest out of Sioux Lookout, and you'll spend about 2 hours over boreal forest. Nothing below you but trees, lakes, more trees. Then a clearing, a runway, a community. Sachigo Lake First Nation sits in the far northwest corner of Ontario, home to roughly 700 people. There is no road. There never has been. The community is part of what's often called the Far North, a collection of First Nations reserves in northwestern Ontario, where road access simply doesn't exist, and where the provincial government has, for decades, offered various plans for connection that have largely remained plans. In winter, an ice road sometimes forms on the rivers and lakes, sometimes, when temperatures hold long enough, when conditions allow. For a few weeks, maybe 8, maybe 12, heavy goods can be trucked in, fuel, building materials, food that doesn't fit on a charter plane. The rest of the year, everything moves by air. And flying things in is not cheap. A bag of flour in Sachigo Lake costs more than it costs in Toronto. Fresh produce, when it arrives at prices that reflect the math of air freight applied to household groceries. This isn't incidental. It's the shape that isolation takes in everyday life. What strikes you, looking at the community's history, is the duration. This isn't a recent problem awaiting a recent solution. People in Sachigo Lake have been navigating fly-in living for generations. They've built schools, nursing stations, community centers, all supplied by air. The question of a road has circulated through political conversations so many times it's almost lost meaning. The boreal forest closes in around the runway when you leave. The tree line doesn't change. The distance doesn't shrink. And somewhere ahead on this list, the isolation gets older and harder. There are places in the Northwest Territories where you genuinely start to lose track of the scale. Colville Lake is one of them. Located about 170 kilometers northeast of Fort Good Hope, this is a settlement of perhaps 150 people, Dean and Métis, living near the shores of Lac des Bois. The lake itself is enormous. The landscape is Mackenzie Valley taiga, rolling into something that begins to feel genuinely Arctic. Winter temperatures drop to -40, sometimes past it. A summer road connects Colville Lake to Fort Good Hope, when conditions allow. But summer road here means a track through muskeg that becomes impassable with rain and which doesn't exist in any condition worth traveling for most of the year. The real lifeline is the ice road, which opens seasonally on the Mackenzie River system, and the charter flights that operate year-round. What makes Colville Lake unusual, even within the context of remote NWT communities, is how deliberately it exists. The community was formally established in the 1960s, partly through the efforts of a Catholic missionary, a story that contains its own complicated dimensions, but the people who settled there chose that land, those lakes, that particular distance from the larger world. There's a quality of intentionality to Colville Lake that other remote communities don't always have. And yet, intentionality doesn't insulate a community from the economics of isolation. Healthcare requires evacuation flights. Higher education means leaving. Supply costs follow the same brutal arithmetic as everywhere else on this list. The lake freezes glassy in October, stays frozen until May. In that stillness, the distance from everything else feels less like a problem and more like a condition of existence. The next place north of here doesn't have even that. If you want to understand what it means to be genuinely, structurally remote, not romantically remote, not adventurously remote, but just far in a way that shapes everything, Ulukaktok is worth sitting with for a moment. It sits on the western coast of Victoria Island, which is the 8th largest island in the world. Arctic tundra, polar bear country, muskox on the hillsides, winter darkness that lasts months. The community of about 500 Inuit and Inuvialuit people has no road connection to anywhere. There is no ice road to the mainland. The only way in or out is by air, or in summer by barge, which arrives a handful of times a season with bulk supplies. Ulukaktok was known for decades as Holmen and was renamed in 2006 to reflect its Inuinnaqtun name, a repatriation of language and identity that happened alongside, and partly in response to, a longer history of colonial administration that had renamed and reorganized Arctic communities with little consultation. The community has become known for its printmaking, an art tradition with deep roots, producing work that has found its way into national collections. There's something quietly remarkable about that. A place that the world largely doesn't think about, producing art that ends up in galleries thousands of kilometers away. The work travels. The makers, by necessity, mostly stay. Supply flights bring fuel, fresh food, medical supplies. What Ulukaktok cannot produce locally, which is almost everything the modern world assumes, must come by air or seasonal barge, at prices that bear no relationship to what people in Edmonton or Ottawa pay for the same things. Victoria Island is visible from space as a massive, roughly triangular mass of land. Most people couldn't name it. Even fewer could point to the small community on its western edge. Some places on this list are remote in a way that's primarily logistical. Wapakeka is remote in a way that has consequences. Located in northern Ontario, about 300 kilometres north of Sioux Lookout, Wapakeka First Nation has a population of around 400 people. No road connection, fly-in only. And in January 2017, the community declared a youth suicide crisis after losing 2 teenagers and identifying a potential suicide pact involving several more young people. The community had applied to Health Canada for mental health funding months before those deaths. The application was rejected. This needs to be said plainly. A fly-in First Nation community in northern Ontario identified a mental health emergency, asked for help through official channels, was turned down, and then lost children. The story received national coverage for a news cycle. Then it receded. What isolation means in Wapakeka isn't just that groceries cost more. It's that a mental health crisis requiring specialist intervention requires flying specialists in, which requires funding, logistics, time. When those systems fail or delay, the consequences aren't inconveniences. They're irreversible. The community has continued. People have continued. There's resilience in Wapakeka that is real and documented, and not something to be either romanticized or used to excuse the failures of federal and provincial systems to provide equitable services to fly-in communities. But there's something about the rejected funding application, filed months before, sitting in a bureaucratic queue while the crisis was already forming, that doesn't fade easily. A document in Ottawa, children in the north. The distance between those two things is more than geographic. Old Crow is the only community in Yukon with no road access. That alone makes it notable. But what makes it genuinely worth understanding is where it sits, at the edge of the Porcupine River, inside the traditional territory of the Vuntut Gwich'in, in a landscape that has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, and that is now, with climate change, changing faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. The community sits at about 67 degrees north latitude, well above the Arctic Circle. Permafrost beneath everything. The Porcupine River, which runs through town and defines the landscape, connects Old Crow to a migration corridor used by the porcupine caribou herd, one of the largest in the world. The Gwich'in relationship with that herd is ancient, documented, foundational. It's not a wildlife management relationship, it's a civilizational one. A gravel airstrip handles all traffic in and out. Charter flights connect Old Crow to Dawson City and Whitehorse. There is no scheduled service most of the year. The roughly 300 residents of Old Crow live with supply chains that are entirely air-dependent, in a community where the land provides significantly more than in most fly-in places, but where the modern economy still arrives by plane. What's happening to Old Crow now is worth watching. Permafrost thaw is undermining infrastructure, buildings, the airstrip itself. The porcupine caribou herd's migration patterns are shifting with changing conditions. A community that has persisted for millennia in one of the harshest environments on the continent is now navigating changes that are moving faster than adaptation historically allows. The Gwich'in people are not passive observers of this. They've been raising alarms in international forums, engaging governments, documenting change. The voices exist. Whether they're heard is a different question. Most Canadians have heard of Atawapiskat. Fewer understand it. The community sits on the western shore of James Bay, in northern Ontario. About 2,000 people, Cree, in a place accessible by winter road for a few months and by air the rest of the year. There's a summer barge service for heavy goods. That's the full inventory of connections. Atawapiskat has been at the center of multiple national crises. A housing emergency in 2011 that put the community on front pages. A youth suicide emergency in 2016 that did the same thing. Federal government interventions that included sending in third-party managers to oversee band finances. A decision widely criticized as a response to symptoms while ignoring causes, and which added bureaucratic friction without addressing the conditions that produced the crises. The land near Atawapiskat is rich. The Victor Mine, a De Beers diamond operation, extracted billions of dollars in diamonds from traditional Cree territory over roughly a decade, then closed. The benefits that flowed to Atawapiskat from that extraction were vastly disproportionate to the value removed. This isn't a contested point. The numbers are documented. What Atawapiskat represents, in the most direct terms possible, is a community on resource-rich land that has been living without adequate housing, clean water infrastructure, and mental health services for decades, while governments debated intervention frameworks and corporations extracted wealth and flew it south. The community endures. The crises get covered. The conditions that produce the crises remain largely intact. That's what makes Atawapiskat hard to look at for too long. Not the remoteness, but the specificity of how systems that could have worked simply didn't. Sanikiluaq is the southernmost community in Nunavut, which sounds like it might mean something. It doesn't really. It sits on the Belcher Islands in southeastern Hudson Bay, a scattered archipelago of flat, wind-scraped rock surrounded by one of the most treacherous stretches of water on the continent. There's no road. There's no realistic prospect of a road. The Belcher Islands are in the middle of Hudson Bay. The community of roughly 900 Inuit people depends on charter flights from Kuujjuarapik in Quebec, a route that weather regularly disrupts, and that costs what flying over open ocean costs. What the Belcher Islands have, historically and presently, is the ocean, walrus, ringed seal, beluga whale, eider duck. The traditional economy of the Inuit people of this archipelago was built entirely around the extraordinary productivity of Hudson Bay's eastern waters, and in many ways, it still is. The land, if land is the right word for these low, rocky islands, provides in ways that make the community less entirely dependent on air freight than some others on this list. But there's a history attached to Sanikiluaq that belongs on this list precisely because of what isolation allowed to happen. In 1941, a government employee named James Eskimo named 2 Inuit men from the Belcher Islands were arrested and tried for killings that occurred within the community. Killings connected to a religious upheaval that had taken hold on the islands, rooted in a charismatic leader who convinced some people that the end of the world was imminent. The isolation of the Belcher Islands meant this crisis developed and intensified without any outside awareness. By the time anyone knew what was happening, people were dead. The trial, conducted in an alien legal system, in a language the accused didn't speak, applying laws they had no prior relationship with, is a document of colonial legal machinery applied to people it was never designed to understand. The islands are still there. The water still moves the same way. What happened in 1941 is recorded in court documents and a handful of historical accounts. Mostly, it's not talked about. Shamattawa sits at the confluence of the Gods River and the Fox River in northern Manitoba, about 700 kilometers northeast of Winnipeg. Charter flights connect it to Thompson. In winter, a seasonal ice road provides limited surface access. That's it. The community of around 1,000 Cree people has appeared in national media repeatedly over the past 2 decades. For housing conditions, for solvent abuse among youth, for overcrowding so severe that multiple families share spaces designed for one. In 2023, a federal public health emergency was declared after a gas-sniffing crisis among children and teenagers escalated past what community resources could address. Gas sniffing, inhalant abuse, is what happens in communities where young people have no recreational infrastructure, no mental health resources, no economic futures to orient toward, and where the cheapest available substance is the fuel that heats the generators. It's a symptom of conditions, not a cause of them. That distinction matters and is frequently lost in the way these stories get told. Shamattawa is one of those places where reading the history creates a kind of specific weight. The isolation isn't incidental to the crises. The cost of delivering mental health professionals, of building adequate housing, of creating recreational facilities, all of it is inflated by the fly-in factor. Every intervention requires a charter flight. Every solution requires a logistical operation. And so, solutions stay partial and temporary and expensive and insufficient. And then a crisis emerges and gets covered. And then the coverage moves on. The Gods River keeps running. The ice forms. The planes land when the weather allows. There's a point in researching Pikangikum where you stop and have to sit with what you're reading. The community is in northwestern Ontario, northeast of Red Lake, connected to the rest of the province by a winter road for roughly 2 months a year, and by air otherwise. Population around 4,000, one of the larger fly-in communities in Ontario. And for a period roughly spanning the 1990s into the 2000s, Pikangikum had one of the highest suicide rates of any community on Earth. Not in Canada. On Earth. The response from government was slow, contested, and chronically underfunded. The community itself, the chief, the council, community members, documented what was happening, requested help, published findings, engaged researchers. The knowledge of what was happening in Pikangikum existed outside Pikangikum. It was known. Papers were written. Recommendations were made. The conditions that produced the crisis, overcrowded housing, lack of clean water, no youth programming, no employment, no road, no accessible healthcare, were identified precisely. They weren't mysterious. And yet the response moved at the pace of bureaucratic processes that had no particular urgency attached to them from the outside. Pikangikum also sits near the Whitefeather Forest, an enormous tract of boreal forest in which the community has sought both control over development decisions and economic participation through a land use planning process that has taken decades and is still not fully resolved. The land around Pikangikum is not worthless. It never was. What's been worth less, historically, is the voice of the people who live there in decisions about it. The community is still there, still fly-in, still navigating systems that were not built for it and have never been adequately rebuilt. In 2005, the water in Kashechewan made the news. The community, James Bay Coast, Northern Ontario, about 1,800 Cree people, had been under a boil water advisory for years. When tests showed E. coli contamination, the government airlifted residents out. Photos circulated of children with skin conditions. The evacuation became national news. The boil water advisory at Kashechewan had not started in 2005. It had been in place periodically for years before. The water treatment plant for the community was located downstream from the sewage outflow. This was a design problem. Known, documented, unaddressed. After the 2005 evacuation, there were commitments. a new water treatment plant, new housing, possible relocation of the entire community to higher ground and better infrastructure. Years of negotiations followed. Some improvements happened. Relocation discussions stretched across multiple federal governments, multiple provincial governments, multiple chief elections in the community, and are still, as of the time this was researched, not fully resolved. The community floods. The land it sits on, low-lying and close to the Albany River, regularly inundates in spring. This has happened so many times that the evacuation is almost routine. Residents packed into planes, sent to host cities in southern Ontario, housed in community centers and hotel rooms while the water recedes, then flown back to restart. Every time this cycle runs, it costs money, federal money. The calculus of building adequate infrastructure in an isolated community versus the perpetual cost of crisis response and evacuation has been done. The numbers reportedly favor building the infrastructure, and yet the cycle continues. There's a phrase that appears in government documents relating to Kashachewan, working toward a long-term solution. It appears across decades of documents. The phrase itself has become a kind of evidence. The northern coast of Labrador is one of the most starkly beautiful and logistically demanding places in Canada. Fjords cutting deep into mountains. Pack ice for half the year. Communities perched on coastlines that have no connection by road to the rest of Labrador, let alone the rest of Canada. The 5 communities of Nunatsiavut, Nine, Hopedale, Makovik, Postville and Rigolet are home to the Labrador Inuit, who in 2005 achieved what is, depending on how you measure it, one of the most significant moments in Indigenous governance in Canadian history, the establishment of a self-governing Inuit homeland with constitutionally protected rights. The Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement is a foundational document. Nunatsiavut, our beautiful land, in Inuktitut, became a reality. And yet the infrastructure conditions in those communities remain, in many respects, those of places that the broader Canadian economy has never fully reached. Nine, the northernmost and largest community, is accessible by air, a gravel runway, charter flights south to Happy Valley Goose Bay. In summer, a coastal ferry runs along the coast. In winter, the ferry stops. The ice road that connects some southern Labrador communities doesn't reach Nain. The communities of the upper Labrador coast exist in a kind of functional isolation that self-governance has not, by itself, resolved. The history here is long and layered. Moravian missionaries arrived in the 18th century and for over a century represented the only sustained outside presence on this coast. A presence that brought both services and transformation to the Inuit communities they established. The bead collection, the music, the church architecture that still marks these communities is partly Moravian inheritance. What happened in the 20th century was federal. The Inuit of Labrador were incorporated into Canadian policy systems, relocation programs, educational disruptions, the whole apparatus of mid-century Indigenous administration, with effects that are still being processed. And then came 1918. An influenza outbreak, arriving by supply ship, moved through the Labrador coast Inuit communities with devastating speed. Communities lost between a third and half their population in weeks. Some places lost more. The isolation that might have protected them became the thing that killed them. No medical resources, no way to get help in, no infrastructure to respond. Those losses were recorded by Moravian missionaries. The accounts exist. What the coast looked like in the winter of 1918-1919, those communities working to bury their dead in frozen ground, is documented in diaries that most Canadians have never read. The fjords don't change. The ice comes in October and moves out in June, more or less, though less reliably now than before. The communities are still there. Nain, Hopedale, Makovik, Postville, Rigolet. Still fly in, still seasonal barge dependent, still governed now by Nunatsiavut, still holding a history that stretches back further than the country that now claims sovereignty over the land beneath them. Self-determination is not the same as infrastructure. Rights are not the same as roads. What the Labrador Inuit built with the 2005 agreement is real and important. What still hasn't arrived is the physical connection to the world that most Canadians take for granted. The coast sits there. The planes come and go. The ice does what ice has always done. There's a specific thing that happens when you spend time with these places. Not visiting them, just learning what's publicly known about them. You start to see the pattern. It's not that Canada forgot these places. Forgetting implies they were once remembered in the right way. These communities were administered, surveyed, mapped. Policies were applied to them. Funding decisions were made about them, often by people who had never been there and would never go. The isolation wasn't passive. It was in many cases a condition that was allowed to persist because changing it cost something, and the people it cost most weren't the ones making the decisions. A country can be large and still know where its edges are. Canada knows where these places are. The coordinates are in every federal database. The communities file their reporting requirements, their funding applications, their formal requests for intervention. The paper trail is long. What changes is whether the distance feels like a problem worth solving at the speed the problem requires. 11 communities, 11 runways, 11 places where the plane is the only way home, and somewhere above each of them, the sky, enormous, indifferent, the same sky as everywhere else, holds whatever arrives next.